let me show you, sir, two horrendous tragedies. When the Belgians colonized the Congo, which is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, King Leopold declared that the Congo was to be his personal property. And King Leopold and his men tortured and murdered several million black Congolese people in an act of genocide equal only to what the Nazis were later to do to the Jews. But under savage ill treatment, under savage torture and humiliation, the Congolese, virtual slaves in their country, still respected Christian missionaries and followed them and gained hope from them. And in 1907, this time in the country today known as Namibia, the Germans embarked on a policy of genocide against the warrior people known as the Hereros. They murdered so many Hereros. They tortured and slaughtered so many men and women of that nation that until as recently as the 1940s, Herero women were still so traumatized by what had happened that they were not producing any young at all. But in spite of the hideous genocide committed by General von Trotha, in spite of the multiple murders, the Herero people clung to the Christian faith. Why? Exactly why? I now come to my people, the Zulus. When King Dingaan murdered the Voortrekker leader Piet Retief, the act was watched by Reverend Owen and Reverend Halstead from their mission station, which was built on a hill overlooking King Dingaan's great village. Halstead and Owen, unharmed by Dingaan, decided to flee from the place after that. And Dingaan was deeply sorrowed that his favorite preachers had decided to leave him. And King Cetshwayo, the warrior king who won the Battle of Isandlwane in 1875 or thereabouts, never harmed missionaries. And a king who followed Cetshwayo, King Dinizulu, who was brutally tortured by the English, had a great friend in Bishop Colenso, a Christian bishop, and his daughters, one of whom was called Mary. Although he had suffered so much at the hands of the British authorities, King Dinizulu never abandoned his white Christian friends. They comforted him, and he depended desperately upon them and their Bible in his darkest hours.
Would the same basic story, Credo, be true of how the British or the Illuminati based in Britain took over Australia too?
Yes, I have found exactly the same stories. The Aborigines, like Africans, were deliberately softened up long before they were colonized by the white people. There were men, mysterious men, who often posed as gods, who undermined the will of the Aborigines to resist the encroachment of the colonialists.
It's also interesting that Captain Cook, who is the guy who's supposed to have, quote, discovered Australia, New Zealand, that area of the world,
Yes.
was actually sponsored and funded and in fact controlled by the Royal Society, which was a Freemasonic and is a Freemasonic science operation based in London.
Yes, sir. Let me show you another interesting thing. There is a man I have been investigating in vain for over 40 years now. A man who committed acts of hideous genocide upon our people here in South Africa. A man of whom historians are so fond that he is practically a white cow whom you may not dare to point a finger at. If you see me sitting in front of you, a man who was demonized over 30 years ago by the South African news media, it was because I asked questions about this white man, Sir George Grey. Who was Sir George Grey? What was he? Was he a Freemason? Was he an Illuminati? How is it that this Sir George Grey, who is the actual founder of the most oppressive laws that British colonialism ever settled our people with, apartheid was laid down by Sir George Grey. The carrying of identity papers was laid down by Sir George Grey in the 1850s, in the last century. And Sir George Grey dealt our kings a mortal blow. But let me first tell you, this man was sent from London to quell a Maori rebellion in New Zealand, which had defeated the efforts of military men. The Maori were unstoppable. Their rebellion was blazing like a bushfire through New Zealand. But when George Grey was sent to New Zealand, he managed to quell this rebellion with very, very little loss of life. What did George Grey do? I have never been able to find a book which tells me exactly what did George Grey do in New Zealand in order to pacify the Maoris who had beaten the efforts of the British soldiers. Because that same George Grey was brought from New Zealand to South Africa in order to quell a great rebellion by the Xhosa people. And George Grey used outright trickery in order to force the Xhosa people to actually destroy themselves. George Grey deliberately and cold-bloodedly tricked the Xhosa people into slaughtering their own cattle, burning their own crops. It is one of the saddest stories of our country's blood-drenched history. And almost overnight, George Grey reduced the Xhosa people of the Eastern Cape into a nation of dying skeletal starvelings. Because after George Grey had manipulated the Xhosas with raw trickery into destroying their crops, destroying their cattle. He practically had them on the plate. Hunger, raw hunger and starvation, achieved what military might had failed to achieve after many, many embattled decades. George Gray was a psychologist par excellence. George Gray was a trickster who knew the native races, and he knew how to exploit their beliefs to bring about their own destruction. Let me show you what Gray did. One day, when great tension was boiling up in the Cape, and when the colonialists were threatened by yet another border war between themselves and the Xhosa people, a number of Xhosa women, amongst them a Sangoma, a priestess diviner called Nongawuse, were tending crops when they heard voices calling out to them in the bush. Nongawuse, because she was a spiritual person and a healer, responded to these voices. She went together with her sister Nonteto to investigate, and they found a deep hollow in the ground, and from this hollow they heard the voices coming. And as the women knelt next to the hollow, the three amazing figures emerged from the grass. Tall men wearing long black robes made of animal skin, with very big hoods on their heads, appeared out of the hollow, and one of their faces were painted white, or so it seemed to the terrified Xhosa women. And these men were unusually tall. And they told the woman, Nongawuse, whom they distinguished by her attire as a traditional healer, that she must go to the Xhosa people and tell them to start killing their cattle and start destroying their crops. Mr. Icke, I want to show you this book, a book which was published many years ago, a book written by me, and which made me one of the most hated black men in South Africa by the white establishment. In this book, I write, amongst other things, about a man called Sir George Gray. And in this book, I questioned certain things about this man, because Sir George Gray was the creator of race discrimination and apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was not really created by the Afrikaners. It was created by this man many, many years ago.
Well, Sir George Gray was Illuminati, a black magician, and fits the bill exactly with what happened in all these other countries you're talking about.
Say, when I raised questions in this book about Sir George Gray, I was savagely attacked by nearly every professor in various universities of South Africa.
The intellectual prostitutes, yeah.
Yes. The liars in ivory towers, as I call them.